and welcome to another video from the Fisherman's Net and Saints Peter and Paul in Npaerville, Illinois. We're looking in this series of videos at the moral sources of our actions, some of the foundations of Catholic moral theology. And in this video we're going to start looking at some of the criteria for judging the moral worth of an action. How do we take an action and decide whether or not that's a good or evil action? And as part of getting to understand what are those criteria, maybe we can look at a few ways that are insufficient, that only really take a look at part of a moral decision. So we're going to look at three aspects or three systems of how to judge a moral act that only take partial view. The first we could name Emotivism. And that is a term where we make emotions primary in judging a moral act. And as we've looked in previous videos, the proper part of the human person that judges the moral worth of an act is not the feelings or the passions or the emotions, but the reason. Only the reason is equipped within the human person to know the truth. And so if we're seeking the truth of a moral good, we wouldn't look to the emotions. And so we very much get caught up in the emotions when it comes to our moral decision making, because a lot of moral decisions of ourselves, of others, are things we get very passionate about. But we can quickly identify if we are getting caught up in emotivism, if our moral reasoning goes something like this. Well, when we're discussing issue X, and I bring up, well, I have a cousin or a best friend who does X, and they're a great person, therefore. You can see that I'd be so emotionally invested in a particular person that really what I'm basing my moral reasoning off of is emotions. So the first thing we have to ask is, are we judging moral actions by reason or by our feelings and emotions? Now, very linked to this emotivism is where we look only at a person's intentions. Is a person sincere, right? Do they have good intentions? And certainly we want to look, when it comes to moral actions, at our intentions. Do we have pure good motives? But if that's all we look at, we're only looking at part of the entire picture. Another system that's not fully there is consequentialism. And this goes by different names and has different kind of shades of meaning. Consequentialism looks at a moral act strictly through its consequences. Consequentialism says an act is good if it has a good outcome, and an act is bad if it has a bad outcome. Another name for this, or a very similar moral system, is utilitarianism, that an act is good if it produces the greatest utility, or utility is defined in various ways, if it has the better outcome. Another very similar system is proportionalism. Proportionalism says, in general, we have these moral principles that we have to stick to, but in some cases, if a proportionate reason is present, we can be excused from that principle or act against that principle. So in all these different cases, consequentialism, utilitarianism, proportionalism, what we're looking at are the consequences. And all of these systems that I just mentioned, we could sum up with the phrase, the end justifies the means. That whatever the end, the outcome is, that justifies how we get there, the means. And again, this is an incomplete picture. It only looks at the consequences. Again, certainly when we're evaluating a moral act, we want to look at the consequences. That's a necessary piece. But if we're only looking at the consequences, odd things can happen. We only get a partial picture. So for instance, things like physician-assisted suicide or active euthanasia are often based on consequentialist or proportionalism type reasoning, where there's a good outcome. Someone is relieved of suffering. And if that's our sole criteria for judging something, then all of a sudden, killing grandma becomes a good thing. And there are other examples. If we look at something in Catholic moral thinking like in vitro fertilization. What's an outcome of in vitro fertilization? Well, we could look at all kinds of beautiful little children that are born and say, well, therefore it must be a good thing, the procedure itself. So there's more than simply the outcome or the consequences. Another system that we can look at that really is damaging to moral reasoning is relativism. Relativism comes in all kinds of various forms and flavors, but at the end of the day, relativism says that moral laws, moral truths, are relative to some sort of other factor. That could be that moral truths are relative to a culture, moral truths are relative to time, they're relative to individuals, and a lot of times they're relative to circumstances. That we really can't put out any broad moral principles, moral truths, because they're all relative to whatever circumstances we're in. That circumstances so change that so do moral truths. Now, for the most part, people are relativists only in a very small area. There's very few people who are across the board moral relativists. You take extreme examples, and this becomes clear that there are no circumstances where, say, racial slavery is all of a sudden okay. That's simply not relative, or vast majority of people would say that's not a relative truth, that is an absolute truth. Or abuse of children, there's no circumstances in which that would be morally justifiable. So it's very difficult to be a moral relativist across the board. For the most part, it seems people are moral relativists when it comes to issues of life and sexuality. And then all of a sudden, matters of culture and preference and taste and circumstances can get rid of general principles. So the moral relativist really looks simply at the circumstances. So here we have these three different moral systems, or systems for judging moral acts, that all only take pieces. Emotivism really can focus on the intention or the motives of the person acting. Consequentialism, proportionalism, utilitarianism look at the consequences, what happens once the act is done. And relativism tends to exalt the circumstances of the act to the top criteria. And all of these, again, only look at a piece of moral reasoning. What each of them leaves out is looking at the act itself. We have the intention, we have the consequences, we have the circumstances, but all three of these really don't look at what is being done. What is the action happening? We call that the moral object. So we're going to see in our next video that when we look at a moral act, yes, we have to take into consideration the intentions of the one acting. We have to take into consideration the circumstances of the act. We have to take into consideration the consequences of the act. But first of all, we simply have to look at the act itself. We call the moral object and say, is this act in and of itself good or evil? And this is one of the things that separates perhaps Catholic morality from a lot of these other systems, because we have to look primarily at the act itself, and we'll see that some acts, it doesn't matter what the consequences are, or what the motives are, or what the circumstances are. Some acts are in themselves always wrong. We call those intrinsically evil. So next time we'll look at this kind of holistic look at morality, the Catholic understanding, where we take a look at the object of the act, what it is, the intentions, the consequences, and the circumstances. So stay tuned for that.